Chapter 9. You are Linnaeus. In the 18th century, the world appeared more and more confusing. Besides the enormous variety of living organisms that men found by looking through their microscopes, travelers pushing into distant parts of the earth were bringing back plants and animals that people of Europe had never seen before. Soon it became apparent that every part of the earth had its own plants, birds, and animals. Sometimes, too, ship's captains brought men and women from Africa or from the East and from the Western Hemisphere. And though there was no doubt that these men and women were human beings, they were not like any of the people who had been seen in Europe before. Science means, among other things, orderly, classified knowledge. So learned societies, universities, individual scholars tried to make some orderly arrangement of the vast and increasing store of knowledge. They made numberless efforts. One man thought he could classify plants according to the color of their blossoms, putting all those with red blooms together and trying to see whether they were in any way alike. Another thought it would be better to arrange them according to their leaves: long leaves, round leaves, indented leaves. He worked very hard, but did not get on very well. There seemed to be too many plants whose leaves did not fit any of his categories. While these men were making fruitless efforts to classify plants, there were others who tried to establish some sort of order in the animal kingdom. They talked of long-haired and short-haired animals, those with horns and those without horns, and so on. They studied fish and insects and crustaceans. All these efforts had the same result, and that was failure. So far as men of the 18th century could see, there was no scheme or plan among the living things of the earth. But in the year 1707, Carl von Linné, later called Carolus Linnaeus, was born to Rushult in Småland, Sweden. There was nothing striking about the boy's birth or his background. His father was the village pastor. The family lived in a small wooden house painted red with a roof of live turf. It was like many other houses in the village, but the house had a garden around it, so that Linnaeus was to say later that it was a good place for a naturalist to be born. All the boy's teachers at school thought him stupid, but a doctor with whom his father talked observed that Carl took an unusual interest in plants and that he could identify a great many. He suggested that his father send him to university, where he could study natural history. Perhaps later he would become a doctor. But such narrow margins are great decisions by such narrow margins are great decisions reached. His father could give him only about $40 for his education, but it was thought that he could work this way. So he set off for the University of Lund. After a year at Lund, he transferred to the University of Uppsala, since Uppsala had a very fine course in botany. His professor was the venerable Olav Rudbeck. Rudbeckia Hirta, or Black-Eyed Susans, have since been named for him. Professor Rudbeck soon grew very fond of Linnaeus and saw great promise in his work. In his conversations with his student, the elderly professor often spoke enthusiastically of a journey to Lapland that he had made in his youth. He told of the reindeer, of the swift mountain streams fed by the melting snows, of the mosses and lichens, the fir trees, the snowfields, the midnight sun. Lapland, which had been a land of romance for the old professor, became a land of romance for the young student, too. After Linnaeus had finished his studies at the university, with Professor Rudbeck's encouragement, he made application to the Royal Society of Sweden to send him on a scientific expedition to Lapland. Linnaeus wrote in the letter of application that he was well qualified to go because, among other things, he had knowledge of natural history and his legs were so strong that he could walk and climb long distances. Whether they were impressed by his knowledge or by the strength of his legs, or both, the Royal Society agreed to the commission. So, on May 2nd, 1732, at 11 o'clock in the morning, Linnaeus set out on foot through the gate of the old walled town of Uppsala on the road leading north. Quote, "It was a splendid spring day, unquote. His diary records, quote, the sky was clear and warm, while a west wind refreshed one with a delicious breath. The winter rye stood 6 inches high, and the barley had newly come into leaf. The birch was beginning to shoot, and all the trees were leafing except the elm and aspen. Though only a few of the spring flowers were in bloom, it was obvious that the whole land was smiling with the coming of spring. When about 8 miles had been traversed, the woods began to increase. The sweetlark, which had hitherto delighted our ears, left us another bird, the redwing taking its place, which sang its sweetest from the fir tops, emulating the nightingale, the master singer. Unquote. The young Linnaeus must have made a cheerful figure as he strode along the road through the little villages and past the farms and on into the wild northern country. Another passage in his diary describes his equipment. Quote, my clothes consisted of a light coat of Westcotton linsey woolsey cloth without folds, lined with red chelloon, having small cuffs and a collar of shag, leather cap, and a pair of shag boots. I carried a small leather bag, half an ell in length, but somewhat less in breadth, furnished on one side with hooks and eyes, so that it could be opened and shut at pleasure. This bag contained one shirt, 2 pairs of full sleeves, 2 half-shirts, an inkstand, a pen case, a microscope, a spyglass, a gauze cap to protect me occasionally from the gnats, a comb, my journal, and a parcel of paper stitched together for drawing plants, both in folio, my manuscript ornithology, flora Landica, and Characteris Generici. I wore a hanger sword at my side and carried a small fowling piece, as well as an octagonal stick gradated for the purpose of measuring. Unquote. His equipment was, in fact, not very different from that of a modern naturalist, except that the fashions in clothes were changed since that day. He traveled mostly on foot over bad roads and through wild country for nearly 1,000 miles. Once the suspicious Laplanders shot at him, but missed. Once at night, he crossed a rushing stream on a raft and nearly lost his life when the logs of the raft parted. But he got back to Uppsala in the autumn and gave the Royal Society a careful account of the things he had seen. In his report, he noted the custom of the Lapps, whose ways were little known to the Swedes. He told of their clothes, of their huts mounted on poles, and of their great herds of reindeer. He also brought back pressed leaves of 23 kinds of willows and described the pearl fishery at Berkshire, and he brought specimens of grasses that were resistant to the greatest cold and forage plants which would color butter deep yellow, as well as directions for making 10 different kinds of bread that could be used when grain failed. Linnaeus presented his report to the Royal Society on November 9th, 1732, and the members were greatly pleased with it. The minutes of the meeting on that date read, quote, Linnaeus' account of his journeys to and from Lapland with its perils and labors was read. It included the history of novelties in all 3 kingdoms of nature, which he supported with his catalogue. Unquote. But more important than his specimens and the information about Lapland, he brought notes on a new system of classification for plants and animals, which he had worked out on his journey. 3 years later, this system was to be published under the title Systema Naturae. It was to bring order out of the confusion. It was the system of nomenclature that has been used ever since. According to Linnaeus' system, every plant and every animal was to be given a double Latin name. The first word, whose initial letter was to be capitalized, would indicate what genus or general class it belonged. For example, there were in various countries large numbers of little plants resembling one another, which he called primula or primroses. This genus is almost worldwide, but one kind of primrose he called Primula vulgaris. Another with purple flowers he called Primula farinosa, and a third, which we would call a cowslip, he called Primula veris. So Linnaeus was able to christen hundreds of flowers, each time naming its genus first, and then adding the particular species. He followed the same system with animals, recognizing easily the difference between the genus of horse or of cat, but indicating in the second part of the name the particular species to which it belonged. Whenever a species was identified, he encouraged scientists who had first observed it to add his own name. The naming of plants and animals in this way was a fascinating task. Linnaeus soon announced that everything in nature could be classified if the scientists but had time and patience. Science, as orderly classified knowledge, was coming into its own. Linnaeus thought that he could even classify all minerals and all diseases. The first edition of Systema Naturae was published in Leyden in 1735. It contained only 12 pages, but its influence was enormous. A copy of the first edition was sent to Dr. Hermann Boerhaave, an eminent physician of Leyden who had published Leeuwenhoek's work. Boerhaave introduced Linnaeus to the great London collector Sir Hans Sloane and to various other notables of the scientific world. Everyone talked of Linnaeus. His fame spread everywhere. In 1738, he went to Paris. His Swedish biographer Fries writes of him, quote, "On his arrival he went first to the Jardin des Plantes, where Bernard de Jesuit was describing in Latin some exotics as rare plants were called. He entered without opportunity to introduce himself. There was one plant which the demonstrator had not yet determined, and which seemed to puzzle him. The Swede looked on in silence, but, observing the hesitation of the learned professor, cried out, 'Haec planta Phaseum Americanum abet.' It has the appearance of an American plant. Jesuit, surprised, turned about quickly and exclaimed, 'You are Linnaeus!' 'I am, sir,' was the reply. The lecture was stopped, and Bernard gave the learned stranger an affectionate welcome." Unquote. Gradually, the boy who was thought so stupid had become the most eminent natural scientist in Europe. He traveled, he married, he settled down at last at the University of Uppsala. There he took up the post of professor of botany, which his old teacher Olaf Rudbeck had held. He made the teaching of botany enormously popular. Often he had as many as 200 or 300 pupils in his classes. Students came from Germany, Italy, Russia, and other places to learn from him. Since the teaching was done in Latin, they had no difficulty in understanding his words. The students in Linnaeus's classes became enthusiastic collectors and classifiers. He taught them not only to use his binomial nomenclature, but to describe each plant according to a regular, orderly system. And he laid great stress on distinguishing as many species as possible. Even the most insignificant flower or weed deserves study and attention, he said. He thought that, quote, "there are as many species as issued in pairs from the hand of the Creator," unquote, and said that no new species had been added since the beginning of the world, an idea with which a modern biologist would certainly disagree. He required his students to go on botanical excursions with him several times each week to collect plants and insects. Everything about the trips was carefully ordered and arranged. Students were to wear easy suits of linen and wide-brimmed hats to act as protection from the sun. One of them was appointed annotator to take down Linnaeus's dictation in case something new was identified. Another was to maintain discipline in the group. Linnaeus himself was always first to arrive in the field, but by 8 o'clock the 200 or 300 students were assembled, and all day long they searched for specimens or gathered around him while he lectured. At evening they marched back to the town with Linnaeus at their head, while French horns and kettle drums played and banners waved. When the parade finally reached the Botanic Garden at the University of Uppsala, the group broke up, but not before the old university walls had resounded to the cry of "Viva Linnaeus!" The field trips were a great joy to Linnaeus. He was fond of saying, quote, "mingle your joys sometimes with your earnest occupation," unquote. And this both teacher and pupil succeeded in doing on their famous trips into the country. The Botanic Garden was another of his satisfactions. He wanted to make it as beautiful as the famous Jardin des Plantes he had seen in France. He thought the Botanic Garden should be a kind of living library of plants so that the public could learn their names and study them. At one time, he had as many as 3,000 different species of plants in the garden. The Empress Catherine of Russia sent him several hundred different kinds of seeds. People in distant places were encouraged to supply him with species of exotic plants. Some of them were sent all the way from Cape Town in South Africa. He was much interested in trying to acclimatize plants and made repeated efforts, though without success, to get Chinese tea to grow in Sweden. After a time, he decided to add birds and animals to the garden. The Crown Prince of Sweden gave him an Indian bear, a matchless cockatoo, and some guinea pigs. Later came an ape, a monkey, 4 kinds of parrots, an orangutan, and some goldfish. Queen Louisa Ulrich gave him a cassowary that lived a long time in the garden, and he was continually amused with the pranks of the monkeys. But he liked the parrots best, and especially one of them. Quote, "It used to sit on his shoulder," his biographer says, sharing his meals. When therefore the parrot felt hungry, it would say, "Mr. Carl, it is 12 o'clock." Unquote. Many visitors came to the garden to see the plants and animals and to talk to the brown-eyed gentleman who was its master. In 1769, Frederick Calvert, Lord Baltimore, on a European visit, rolled up to the door in a coach and four. He had gone to see Linnaeus before he visited the king, and was so delighted with what he saw in the garden that he sent Linnaeus a gold snuff box to commemorate the visit and a necessaire of silver to the value of 300 pounds. As the years passed, Linnaeus wrote several books on animals and plants, but none was more important than the little Systema Naturae that he had worked on his Lapland journey. Scholars everywhere spoke his name with great respect now. He was Sweden's great man. The Swedish Parliament gave him a title. At 70, he was still hale and hearty. He suffered sometimes from gout, but he said he knew how to control it by eating wild strawberries. He died in 1778. The botanical and zoological gardens fell into decay. His widow sold all his papers and writings to the British collector. The King of Sweden, on hearing this, and hearing that they were to be taken out of the country, dispatched a sloop to try to overtake the vessel that carried them, but the vessel got away. The papers have been considered ever since a great treasure of the Linnean Society in London. But though his gardens fell into decay and his writings were taken to London, his students continued the work he had begun. From his classroom and from the fields of his botanical excursions, they scattered everywhere, collecting, examining, classifying. One of them went to the far South Seas, another to Antarctica, in Africa, in Asia, in the Western Hemisphere. They were pointing, as Linnaeus had done, to the beauty and the intricacy of the living world. And like their master Linnaeus, they were pointing to the endless variety of species. They had not yet begun to ask what makes one species of an animal or plant differ from another. That would come later.